The wind moved slowly across the dry hillside, bending the tall grass in uneven waves, as if the land itself was breathing. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, just another quiet stretch of terrain under a pale, indifferent sky. But beneath that stillness, hidden so well that even trained observers would miss it, a single figure lay motionless. Elias Varn had been in position for hours, his body aligned with the slope, his presence erased into the natural patterns of the environment. He wasn't just hiding, he was part of the landscape. Long before this moment, his name had begun circulating in reports that didn't quite make sense. Analysts noticed inconsistencies, timelines that didn't match the distances covered, angles of engagement that seemed impossible from known positions, results that appeared too precise to be explained by standard methods. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence or the product of exceptional skill. But as the pattern repeated itself, the questions grew louder. Something about the way Elias operated didn't fit within the known limits of movement and observation. The term came later, shadow link. No one could clearly say where it originated, only that it started appearing in conversations among those who had reviewed the footage or worked alongside him in the field. It wasn't an official classification at first, just a name given to something difficult to explain, because what Elias was doing didn't look like movement in the traditional sense. There were no clear transitions, no visible repositioning. One moment he would be observing from one angle, and the next, he had a completely different line of sight, as if the space between those positions simply didn't exist. Command eventually took notice. Old mission recordings were pulled and analyzed frame by frame. What they found only deepened the mystery. There were no gaps in the footage, no cuts or distortions, and yet Elias appeared in places he shouldn't have been able to reach without being seen. The data showed continuous observation, but the conclusions defied logic. It wasn't just about where he was, it was about when he moved. The realization began to take shape that his effectiveness wasn't based purely on physical skill, but on timing so precise that it exploited the smallest lapses in human perception. A controlled observation was arranged, though never formally documented. Elias was placed in a monitored environment, every angle covered, every movement tracked in real time. The objective was simple: understand how he did it. For hours, nothing unusual happened. He behaved like any other operator, careful, methodical, predictable. Then, gradually, something shifted. His movements became smaller, almost imperceptible, synchronized with the subtle rhythms of the observers themselves. When attention drifted, even for a fraction of a second, he moved. When focus returned, he was already somewhere else. Reviewing the footage later became an exercise in frustration. Analysts slowed it down, replayed sequences repeatedly, searching for the moment of transition. But it never appeared. There was no clear point where he left one position and arrived at another. The continuity remained intact, yet the outcome suggested otherwise. It was as if Elias had learned to exist in the gaps between observation, moments so brief they were normally irrelevant, but in his hands became pathways. That was when the nature of the technique became clearer. It wasn't invisibility. It wasn't speed. It was anticipation. Elias wasn't reacting to what others were doing, he was predicting it. Every scan, every shift of attention, every unconscious pause in perception became part of a pattern he could read. And once he understood that pattern, he could move through it without being noticed. He didn't avoid being seen by hiding better than others. He avoided being seen by ensuring no one was looking at the exact moment he moved. The implications were difficult to ignore. In controlled conditions, the technique demonstrated an effectiveness that exceeded expectations. Positions previously considered unreachable became accessible. Observation networks designed to eliminate blind spots began to show weaknesses, but with that effectiveness came uncertainty. The method relied entirely on the operator's interpretation of human behavior in real time. There was no margin for error, no standardized way to replicate it, and no guarantee that another individual could achieve the same results. Then came the mission that changed everything. The details remained classified, but enough was known to understand the scale of what had happened. A region heavily monitored by multiple spotters, each positioned to cover overlapping fields of view, leaving no clear path for undetected movement. The assignment was straightforward: observe and report. Engagement was not the priority. For the first phase of the operation, Elias followed those instructions precisely. His reports were consistent, his positioning conventional. But something shifted as the mission progressed. The pattern of the spotters became clearer, their routines predictable. What had initially appeared to be an impenetrable network revealed subtle imperfections, tiny gaps in coordination, brief moments where coverage overlapped imperfectly. For most, those gaps would have been too small to matter. For Elias, they were enough. Without announcing it, without altering the official plan, he began to apply the technique. Movements that should have triggered detection went unnoticed. Lines of sight that should have exposed him remained empty. One by one, the spotters disappeared from their positions. There were no alarms, no confirmed sightings, no clear indication of how it was happening. From the outside, it looked as if the network was simply failing on its own. By the time command understood the situation, it was already over. The entire system of observation had collapsed, dismantled with a precision that left more questions than answers. The mission was declared a success, but the method behind it became the focus of intense scrutiny. Every detail was reviewed, every decision analyzed, and the conclusion, when it came, was both simple and unsettling. The shadow link technique was too effective. Not because it broke the rules, but because it operated beyond them. It depended on instinct, perception, and timing in ways that couldn't be measured or controlled. It placed too much power in the hands of a single operator, with too little oversight. And perhaps most concerning of all, it couldn't be reliably taught. What Elias could do wasn't something that could be easily passed on or regulated. The decision that followed was immediate and final. The technique was prohibited, not erased from records, not denied, but removed from active use. Any indication of its application would be flagged, reviewed, and stopped. It was a precaution, a way to maintain structure in environments where unpredictability could lead to unintended consequences. Elias accepted the decision without resistance. He continued his work, adapted to standard protocols, and spoke little about the past. But the understanding he had developed didn't disappear. It remained, quiet and unchanged, waiting beneath the surface. Now, lying on that silent hillside, watching a new network of spotters establish control over the terrain, he recognized the same patterns he had seen before. Different environment, different conditions, but the same illusion of complete visibility, the same assumption that nothing could move without being seen. The wind shifted slightly, brushing against his position. Through the scope, distant figures adjusted their stance, scanning the horizon with practiced precision. To anyone else, the system would appear flawless. Elias knew better. He slowed his breathing, narrowing his focus as the world around him faded into fragments, angles, timing, rhythm. The years between then and now seemed irrelevant. The lessons, the decisions, the consequences, all of it led back to this moment. The technique had been forbidden, but it had never truly disappeared. And as he remained perfectly still, waiting for the exact instant when attention would drift, even for the smallest fraction of time, one truth became impossible to ignore. Some methods are banned not because they fail, but because they work too well. The situation began to change long before anyone officially acknowledged it. At first, it was just a delay, minor, almost unnoticeable. Reports were coming in slower than expected, movements on the ground weren't aligning with projected timelines, and the teams assigned to advance through the valley kept encountering the same invisible barrier. No matter how carefully they moved, no matter how precise their coordination was, they were being seen. Not directly, but enough. Every approach triggered a response. Every attempt to reposition was met with subtle adjustments from the other side. It wasn't chaos, it was control. Someone, somewhere across that ridge, was watching everything. Elias observed it all in silence. Through his scope, the pattern was becoming clearer with each passing minute. The spotters weren't just placed well, they were working together. Their fields of vision overlapped with calculated precision, leaving almost no gaps between them. It was the kind of system designed by people who understood not just terrain but behavior. They weren't waiting to react. They were anticipating movement. And that changed everything. Standard tactics relied on exploiting blind spots, areas where visibility broke down, where movement could slip through unnoticed. But here, those blind spots barely existed. And when they did, they were too brief, too unpredictable for most operators to use effectively. To move through this network required more than patience. It required timing that bordered on impossible. Behind Elias, communication lines remained active but restrained. Orders were clear. Hold position, continue observation, wait for coordinated movement. The command structure was doing exactly what it was designed to do: minimize risk, maintain control, avoid unnecessary exposure. But the situation on the ground wasn't improving. Every minute that passed strengthened the enemy's advantage. Their spotters weren't just watching, they were learning, adjusting, refining their coverage with each failed attempt from the opposing side. What had started as a strong defensive network was becoming something far more adaptive. Elias shifted his focus slightly, tracking a distant figure along the ridge. The movement was subtle, almost routine, but it revealed something important: a rhythm. The spotter paused at regular intervals, scanning a fixed arc before resetting. Nearby, another did the same, but offset by just enough to maintain continuous coverage. It looked seamless. It was. There were gaps. Small ones, fractions of seconds, moments so brief they would normally be dismissed as irrelevant. But to Elias they stood out like fractures in an otherwise solid structure. He had seen this before. Not the exact formation, not the same terrain, but the same principle. A system designed to eliminate uncertainty, yet still dependent on human perception. And human perception always had limits. A quiet voice came through the comms, breaking the stillness. A request for updated visuals, confirmation of positions, routine, controlled, careful. Elias responded briefly, his tone steady, his words precise. Nothing in his voice suggested what he was seeing or what he was beginning to consider, because what he was thinking didn't align with protocol. The orders were to wait, to coordinate, to move as a unit when the opportunity presented itself. But the opportunity wasn't coming, not in a form that command could use. Elias exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving the ridge. Another pattern revealed itself: two spotters, positioned at slightly different elevations, adjusting their stance in near synchronization. For a brief instant, both lines of sight shifted away from a narrow corridor between them. Less than a second. Then it was gone. To most, it would mean nothing. To Elias, it meant everything. That was the space. Not a place, but a moment. A point in time where observation failed, not completely, not obviously, but just enough. The kind of gap that couldn't be marked on a map or communicated over a radio. It had to be seen, understood, used in real time. His grip tightened slightly, not out of tension but focus. The shadow link technique wasn't about speed. It wasn't about taking risks or pushing limits. It was about precision, moving only when movement became invisible within the natural rhythm of observation. Done correctly, it didn't break the system. It passed through it. But it also came with consequences. Elias knew that better than anyone. The last time he had used it, the outcome had forced command to reconsider everything they thought they understood about control in the field. It had worked, but it had also revealed how little oversight there truly was when an operator stepped outside established boundaries. That was why it had been banned. Not because it failed, because it removed the margin for intervention. Another update came through the comms, this time sharper, carrying a hint of urgency. A team attempting to reposition had been forced to pull back. Detected again. No casualties, but the message was clear. The current approach wasn't working. Silence followed. Not complete, but heavy. The kind that settles in when options begin to narrow. Elias adjusted his position by a fraction, aligning his view with a slightly different angle of the ridge. From here, the pattern became even clearer. The spotters weren't perfect. They couldn't be. Their coordination relied on consistency, and consistency always created predictability. Predictability created openings, but only for those willing and able to use them. He closed his eyes briefly, not to rest but to visualize the ridge, the positions, the timing between each scan. He mapped it all out, not in space but in sequence. One movement leading into another, each dependent on the exact moment it occurred. There was a path. Not a safe one. Not an approved one. But a path. When he opened his eyes again, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. The landscape was the same, the wind still moving across the hillside, the distant figures continuing their silent watch. But now, the gaps between them were no longer hidden. They were waiting. Elias remained still for a few seconds longer, listening to the quiet rhythm of his own breathing, the distant murmur of controlled communication behind him, the almost imperceptible shifts of movement ahead. Then, without a word, without any signal to indicate what he was about to do, he made a decision. Not sudden, not impulsive, inevitable. He wasn't ignoring orders. He was stepping beyond them. Because the system in front of him couldn't be broken from the outside. It had to be entered. And as his focus locked onto the first narrow window of opportunity, a moment so brief it barely existed, one truth settled in with absolute clarity. Waiting would change nothing, but moving at the exact right moment could change everything. He didn't move immediately. That was the difference between impulse and precision. Elias remained perfectly still, his eyes locked onto the ridge as the pattern unfolded again and again. The temptation to act was there, subtle but persistent, pushing at the edges of his focus. But the shadow link technique was never about reacting to the first opportunity. It was about waiting for the right one, the moment where every variable aligned, even if only for a fraction of a second. Another cycle passed. Then another. Each one revealing more detail, more consistency hidden within what appeared to be controlled unpredictability. The spotters were disciplined, but they were still human. Their movements followed rhythms they didn't even realize they were repeating. Slight pauses, micro-adjustments, tiny delays between one scan and the next. Elias tracked them all, mapped them, became part of them. Then it happened. A shift barely noticeable. Two spotters along the upper ridge adjusted at the same time, their lines of sight drifting just enough to create a narrow corridor between them. It would last less than a second. For anyone else, it was nothing. For Elias, it was the opening. He moved. Not fast, not rushed, just enough. His body slid forward, controlled and silent, covering ground that should have exposed him. But it didn't, because in that exact moment, no one was looking. By the time the spotters returned to their positions, the space he had occupied was empty. He was already somewhere else. No alarms. No reaction. Just silence. He paused again, allowing the pattern to settle, letting the environment absorb his presence. The technique demanded patience after movement, not just before it. Every step had to disappear completely before the next could begin. Through his scope, the ridge shifted slightly in perspective. The angle was different now, subtle, but enough to reveal something new. A blind edge behind a rock formation, a narrow dip in the terrain that hadn't been visible before. Another path. Elias adjusted his breathing, syncing it with the rhythm he had already memorized. The world around him narrowed into a sequence of moments, each one measured, each one precise. Time didn't feel continuous anymore. It felt segmented, divided into windows of possibility. And he moved through those windows. Again. A second shift. Another fraction of space crossed without detection. The grass barely reacted. The ground made no sound. And once again. By the time observation returned, he was gone from where he had been. Closer now. The distance between him and the first spotter had shortened significantly, close enough to see detail without magnification. The outline of the figure, the positioning of the equipment, the slight tension in posture that came with sustained focus. The spotter was good. Careful. Unaware. Elias remained still, watching. This was where the technique became something more than movement. This was where it transitioned into control, because once inside the network, once past the outer layer of observation, the rules changed. The system that had once been a barrier was now a structure he could navigate from within. Another cycle. The spotter shifted, scanning left, then right, following a routine that had likely been drilled into him over countless hours. Reliable, consistent, predictable. Elias didn't rush. He waited for the exact moment where attention moved just slightly too far, where focus narrowed in the wrong direction, where awareness dipped, not completely, but enough. And then he acted. The motion was minimal, efficient, silent. And when it was over, the ridge looked exactly the same. One less set of eyes. No signal. No indication. Just absence. Elias didn't linger. He had already mapped the next movement before the first was complete. The second spotter was positioned lower, partially obscured by terrain, relying more on peripheral awareness than direct line of sight. A different challenge, a different rhythm. But still human. Still limited. Elias shifted again, using another brief lapse in observation to reposition. Each movement brought him deeper into the network, closer to its core. The risk increased with every step, but so did the advantage. Because the closer he got, the more the system began to break down from within. The second spotter never saw him. Didn't have the chance to. Another silent removal, another gap in the network. Still no alarm. Still no reaction. From a distance, everything appeared intact. But it was. Elias paused once more, lowering his profile as he observed the remaining positions. 3 left, their coordination unchanged for now. They hadn't noticed the gaps yet. The system was still functioning on the assumption that all parts were in place. That assumption wouldn't last. But for the moment, it was enough. A faint sound carried across the ridge, distant, almost lost in the wind. One of the remaining spotters adjusted position, compensating for something he didn't fully understand. A slight shift in coverage, an unconscious attempt to correct an imbalance he couldn't yet see. It created a new opening. Different from the others. Shorter. Riskier. Elias studied it carefully, calculating the sequence required to pass through it. This was where the technique demanded its highest level of precision. One miscalculation, one fraction of a second too early or too late, and the entire operation would collapse. He exhaled slowly. Waited. Watched. Then moved. The third transition was the most delicate so far, threading through overlapping lines of sight that left almost no room for error. But once again, the timing held. The pattern remained consistent, and when the moment passed, he was through. Still unseen, still untraceable. From the outside, the ridge remained quiet, controlled, stable. But inside, it was already unraveling. 3 spotters remained, and for the first time since the operation began, the outcome was no longer uncertain. It was inevitable. For a brief moment, everything held together. From a distance, the ridge still looked intact, 3 spotters maintaining their positions, scanning their sectors with the same disciplined precision as before. Nothing about their movements suggested failure. Nothing indicated that the system they relied on had already begun to collapse from within. But Elias could see it. Not directly. In the timing, the rhythm had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The removal of 2 spotters had created a delay, a hesitation in the pattern. The remaining 3 were compensating, adjusting their coverage without fully understanding why. Their movements were no longer perfectly synchronized. The seamless overlap that once defined their network now contained microscopic fractures. And those fractures were growing. Elias stayed low, his body pressed into the terrain as he observed the shift unfold. This was the most dangerous phase, not the entry, not the first eliminations, but the moment when the system began to realize something was wrong. Because once awareness replaced routine, unpredictability followed. One of the spotters paused longer than before, scanning an area that should have already been covered. Another adjusted position, widening his angle in an attempt to fill a gap he couldn't quite identify. The third remained steady, but even that steadiness carried tension, an unconscious awareness that something in the pattern had changed. They were close to noticing. Very close. Elias slowed his breathing even further, reducing every possible movement to nothing. At this distance, the margin for error no longer existed. There were no safe windows here, only narrow chances that had to be taken with absolute precision. He focused on the nearest target. This one was different from the others, more alert, more responsive. His scanning pattern wasn't as rigid, it adapted, shifted based on what he perceived. That made him harder to predict but not impossible, because even adaptive behavior followed limits. Even awareness had blind edges. Elias watched carefully, letting the pattern reveal itself. There, a hesitation. Not in movement, but in decision. The spotter paused mid-scan for just a fraction longer than necessary, his attention pulled toward an area that no longer required it. A correction, a mistake disguised as caution. That was enough. Elias moved. Closer now, the action required even less motion than before. A controlled extension, a precise adjustment, a moment that passed so quickly it barely registered in time itself. And then, silence. The third spotter was gone. No signal. No warning. Just absence. But this time, the effect was immediate. The remaining 2 felt it. Their movements changed instantly, no longer routine, no longer smooth. One turned sharply, scanning toward the position where his teammate should have been. The other shifted his stance, tightening his field of view, abandoning the wider coverage in favor of immediate confirmation. The system had broken. Not completely, but enough. Elias didn't hesitate. This was the turning point, the moment where control shifted entirely. The shadow link technique thrived in structured patterns, but it didn't depend on them. Once inside, once the system began to collapse, it became something else entirely. Now it was about speed of thought. Decision. Execution. The fourth spotter moved first, attempting to reposition for better visibility. It was the right instinct, but too late. In doing so, he created exactly what he was trying to prevent, a gap. Elias saw it instantly. Used it. Closed the distance without being seen, moving through the confusion that now replaced precision. The timing no longer needed to be perfect, only better than the opponent's reaction. Another silent action. Another disappearance. 4. Only one remained. The last spotter didn't move at first. He stayed exactly where he was, scanning slowly, deliberately, as if refusing to acknowledge what was happening. But beneath that control, there was tension. Elias could see it in the posture, in the slight tightening of movement, in the way the scan lingered just a fraction too long on empty positions. He knew. Not how, not where, but he knew something was wrong. And that made him the most dangerous one yet. Because now there was no pattern to rely on, no predictable rhythm, only awareness, sharp, focused, searching for anything out of place. Elias lowered himself even further, minimizing his profile against the terrain. This final step would be the most difficult, not because of distance, but because of uncertainty. The technique relied on exploiting expectation. And now there was none. For several long seconds, nothing happened. The wind moved. The grass shifted. The ridge remained silent. Then slowly, the last spotter adjusted his position, just slightly, just enough to change his angle of view. It was a cautious move, controlled, but it revealed something critical. Even in uncertainty, he was still human. Still limited. Still bound by the need to observe in sequence, not all at once. And in that sequence, there was a gap. Elias didn't wait for confirmation. Didn't hesitate. He moved the instant the opening appeared, committing fully to the action. There was no second attempt, no correction if it failed. Only precision. Only timing. The distance closed in silence. And then, nothing. The ridge fell still. Completely. 5 positions. 5 absences. No alarms. No signals. No trace. Where there had once been a network, layered, coordinated, nearly impenetrable, there was now only empty space. The system hadn't just been disrupted. It had been erased. Elias remained where he was for a moment longer, watching, listening, ensuring that what he had done had fully settled into the environment, that there were no delayed reactions, no unseen variables waiting to surface. But there was nothing. Only wind. Only silence. And in that silence, one undeniable truth emerged, clearer than ever before. The technique hadn't just worked. It had dismantled everything. For a long moment, nothing moved. The ridge, once alive with silent coordination, now stood completely still. No shifting figures, no scanning patterns, no overlapping fields of vision, just empty positions where presence had existed minutes before. The wind carried across the terrain as if nothing had happened, brushing over the same ground, the same rocks, the same lines of sight that had once formed an unbreakable system. Elias remained in place, unmoving. Not out of caution alone, but discipline. The shadow link technique didn't end with action. It ended with confirmation. Every movement, every decision had to settle fully before the operator allowed the moment to pass. Because sometimes, the most dangerous part of an operation wasn't execution. It was assuming it was over. He observed the ridge carefully, scanning each former position one last time. No secondary movement, no delayed response, no hidden layer waiting to reveal itself. The network was gone. Completely. Behind him, the comms line came to life. At first just fragments, uncertain, overlapping voices trying to make sense of what they were seeing, requests for confirmation, repeated checks of visual feeds, questions without immediate answers. Then clarity. The teams monitoring the ridge had noticed the same thing. The spotters were no longer there, not repositioned, not withdrawn in any coordinated manner. Just gone. Elias didn't respond immediately. There was nothing simple about what had just happened and no straightforward way to explain it. From Command's perspective, the outcome was clear. A critical obstacle had been removed without engagement, without detection, without loss. A perfect result. But Elias knew better. He exhaled slowly, finally allowing his body to release a fraction of the tension it had held. The technique had worked exactly as it had before, precise, efficient, absolute. And that was the problem. A direct request came through the comms, this time more focused. Confirmation of visual status, clarification of movement, a question that carried more weight than the words themselves suggested. How? Elias kept his answer simple. Positions are clear. Nothing more. No details. No explanation. Because there wasn't one that would fit within protocol. Silence followed again, but it was a different kind now. Not confusion, not uncertainty, something heavier. The kind of silence that forms when people understand the outcome but not the method behind it. And that silence traveled quickly. By the time Elias repositioned and began his slow withdrawal from the ridge, the information had already started moving up the chain of command. Reports were being compiled in real time. Observations cross-checked, footage reviewed from every available angle, trying to find the moment where everything changed. But just like before, it wouldn't be there. Hours later, in a secured environment far from the field, analysts would sit in front of screens, replaying the same sequences over and over again. They would slow the footage down, isolate frames, track environmental changes, searching for anything that explained how 5 trained spotters had been removed without a trace. They would find nothing conclusive. Only continuity. Only absence. And eventually, the same conclusion that had been reached years earlier would begin to surface once again. The technique hadn't failed. It had worked too well. Back on the ground, Elias moved with the same controlled precision, but now within standard parameters, visible, trackable, aligned with protocol. The contrast was clear. When he chose to operate within the system, everything about his movement could be understood, predicted, explained. But what he had done on that ridge didn't belong to the system. By the time he reached a safe distance, the first direct communication from command came through. It was measured, controlled, but beneath it was something unmistakable. Concern. Not about the outcome. About the implication. There were no immediate questions about targets or positioning. No tactical breakdown requested. Just a single instruction, delivered with quiet authority. Report in full. Elias paused for a brief moment. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. Every detail he provided would be analyzed, every word examined, and eventually the same discussion would begin again, the one that had led to the technique being banned in the first place. Could it be controlled? Should it be used? Or was it something that existed outside the boundaries they were trying to maintain? He looked back once, toward the ridge now barely visible in the distance. From here, it was just another piece of terrain. No sign of what had happened. No indication that, for a brief period of time, it had been the center of something that challenged the limits of control and perception. Then he turned away. His voice, when he finally responded, was calm, precise, professional. But even in its clarity, it left out the one thing that mattered most. There are methods that can be taught. Methods that can be regulated, refined, and repeated. And then there are methods that exist on the edge of something else entirely, where success depends not just on skill, but on perception, timing, and a willingness to step beyond what is defined as safe. The shadow link technique belonged to the latter. Command would review the operation. They would analyze the results, revisit old conclusions, and likely reinforce the same decision they had made before. ban it, contain it, keep it from becoming something they couldn't control. But decisions like that don't erase knowledge. They don't remove capability. They only delay its use. As Elias disappeared into the landscape, becoming once again just another unseen presence among many, one quiet truth remained, unspoken but undeniable. Some techniques leave no trace, no evidence, no explanation, only results. And results are very hard to ignore.